For years, Tanzania stood as one of East Africa's quiet success stories, a nation steady, peaceful, and led by a woman once hailed as a reformer. President Samia Suluhu Hassan was praised for her calm demeanor and diplomatic grace after inheriting a divided country upon the death of John Magufuli. To her neighbors, she represented continuity and stability. To the world, she was proof that democracy could still take root on African soil. But by November 2025, that illusion began to crack. Tanzania's National Electoral Commission proudly announced her re-election with 97.6% of the vote, later quietly corrected to 98% in some regions. 98%. It was a number so impossible that even her closest allies struggled to hide their disbelief. For nearly 2 weeks, the region stayed silent, following the unwritten rule that African presidents never publicly question one another's legitimacy. Yet one by one, that silence shattered. From Kenya's William Ruto to Botswana's Khama to AU envoy Mokgweetsi Masisi, a rare thing happened. African leaders began to speak not as politicians protecting each other, but as citizens defending truth. The question that hung in the air was no longer about Tanzania alone. It was about the soul of a continent. How long can Africa survive when its elections become theater and silence becomes complicity? When will leadership mean listening to the people, not counting imaginary votes? The story of Tanzania's 98% election is not just a scandal, it's a turning point. It reveals the moment when the old brotherhood of silence broke apart and a new generation of African leaders decided that loyalty to the people must come before loyalty to power. If you believe Africa deserves honesty more than applause, share this story. Subscribe if you believe that the truth, not convenience, should guide leadership. It began like every other election night. Cameras rolled, drums beat, and Tanzania's National Electoral Commission declared victory. President Samia Suluhu Hassan, the announcer read, has won a resounding 97.6% of the national vote. Within hours, the number changed. Some regions quietly adjusted it to 98%, a tiny edit that spoke volumes. At first, the announcement drew polite applause from state media. But outside the polished studios, the mood was different. Journalists whispered, opposition leaders vanished, and the military appeared on the streets in the name of maintaining calm. For the people of Tanzania, this was not a celebration, it was a warning. Beneath the official fanfare, reports began to leak. The Chadema opposition party claimed that over 1,200 of its members had been detained in the days leading up to the vote. 14 of 15 opposition candidates had been disqualified before ballots were even printed. And Tundu Lissu's political aide, one of the few voices still daring to challenge the government, had been found dead, the cause of death listed as accidental. Those details never appeared on Tanzanian television, but they flooded the online world. TikTok, X, and Telegram platforms too, decentralized for the regime to silence completely. The hashtag #RamTanzania98% started trending across East Africa. What began as laughter soon turned into outrage. Meanwhile, foreign journalists who had come to cover the election described an atmosphere of intimidation. Military everywhere, one AU observer later said, heavy presence, people afraid to talk. This was not a normal election. Another described walking into polling stations where soldiers stood beside ballot boxes and where voters were asked for their IDs, their fingerprints, and quietly their loyalty. Still, the government celebrated. President Suluhu's inauguration took place under a blazing Dar es Salaam sun. Dignitaries arrived in convoys. Musicians sang of victory, and yet not a single major East African leader attended in person. Kenya sent no official delegation. Uganda's president sent a polite letter, but not himself. Rwanda, always cautious, sent a deputy minister. Only Zimbabwe and Mozambique, long used to defending questionable elections, appeared fully represented. In the days that followed, Tanzanian state media shifted from pride to defensiveness. Editors were ordered to ban the term contested election. Television anchors repeated phrases like foreign interference and imperial propaganda. But the damage had been done. Across the border, people were already talking. That's when the first voice broke the silence. During a live interview on Al Jazeera, Kenya's President William Ruto was asked directly, "Is there still democracy in Tanzania?" He hesitated, smiled, and said quietly, "It's not for me to judge Tanzania." But 97%. That seems a bit fishy, doesn't it? The interviewer pressed again. Ruto shrugged and added, "In a democracy like Kenya, you can never get 96%. We must always allow for alternative voices." That's the heart of democracy. It was not a declaration, it was a spark. Within hours, Ruto's words went viral across East Africa. Tanzanian broadcasters cut the segment, but it was too late. The clip spread online, reshared millions of times, dubbed in Swahili, Kikuyu, and even French. Commentators began calling it the sentence that broke the wall. For the first time in recent memory, a sitting East African president had publicly questioned the legitimacy of another. It was an act both daring and dangerous. Tanzania and Kenya share over $1 billion in annual trade, and the two nations have historically avoided open criticism. Yet Ruto had done what no one expected. He had spoken the truth aloud. His words, though measured, carried the weight of a new reality. The brotherhood of silence that had bound African leaders for decades, the unspoken agreement to never call out another president's sins, had begun to crumble. And that crack, as small as it seemed, would soon become an earthquake. Because if one leader could question another, what stopped the rest from following? When the world heard William Ruto's off-script remark, it was like a crack of thunder cutting through the polite clouds of African diplomacy. But what followed turned that thunder into a political storm. On the morning of November 10, 2025, cameras flashed at Lukenya University in Kenya, where former Botswana President Ian Khama was set to deliver a keynote speech on leadership and accountability in modern Africa. What began as an academic forum quickly turned into a moral reckoning. Khama, known for his military discipline and his years commanding the Botswana Defense Forces, did not speak with hesitation. He did not speak in codes or hints. He spoke like a soldier tired of pretense. It is totally unacceptable, he began, voice rising over the applause. It is totally unacceptable when an African leader, in order to stay in power, resorts to killing his or her own people. When a leader rigs elections as if they are God's gift to their nation, that is not leadership. That is tyranny. The audience, stunned at first, rose to their feet. Khama then did the unthinkable. He named names. And my apologies to those who come from Tanzania, but the recent election and what transpired around it, I for one do not recognize the person who was inaugurated as president. She is an illegitimate president. No former African head of state had gone that far in decades. His statement spread across the continent within hours. Tanzanian authorities immediately blacked out regional news channels. But it was too late. Every word, every frame of that speech was already online, cut into clips translated into Swahili, shared across Africa's youth networks. Khama's words carried a kind of moral gravity that diplomats could not easily dismiss. He wasn't just a critic, he was a former soldier, a former president, and a respected statesman who had built Botswana into one of Africa's most stable democracies. His attack on Suluhu's legitimacy was therefore not just personal, it was historical. By evening, the shockwaves reached Gaborone, Nairobi, and even Addis Ababa. Botswana's sitting president, Mokgweetsi Masisi, found himself in an awkward position, leading the African Union's election observation mission that had just returned from Tanzania. Hours after Khama's speech, Masisi's team released its long-awaited official report. The conclusion was devastating. The 2025 Tanzanian general election, the AU mission declared, failed to comply with the principles and obligations of the African Union Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. The report listed a grim catalog of abuses, the systematic exclusion of opposition candidates, the monopoly of state media by the ruling party, credible reports of violence, intimidation, and enforced disappearances. It was the first time in 2 decades that the African Union had refused to recognize the results of a member state's election. The dominoes kept falling. Days later, the Southern African Development Community, SADC, issued its own verdict, almost identical in tone. The process, it said, failed to meet the standards of transparency, inclusivity, and freedom of expression. Within diplomatic circles, these 2 statements were nothing short of revolutionary. For decades, African institutions had been accused of looking the other way, of validating even the most fraudulent elections under the banner of African solidarity. Now that solidarity was cracking open from within, international donors took notice. The European Union quietly froze development funds earmarked for Tanzania's media and governance programs. Canada suspended an infrastructure loan. And within the United States Senate, a bipartisan group called for a review of all aid to Dar es Salaam until democratic processes are restored. Yet beyond the official statements and press releases, what truly defined this moment was the silence of Tanzania itself. Inside the country, state television kept airing patriotic songs. The government accused its critics of neo-colonial interference. And yet everyone knew something irreversible had happened. For the first time in modern African history, a sitting president was not only doubted by the people, but by her peers. The same fraternity of heads of state who once guarded one another like brothers had begun to fracture. The old Africa, one Kenyan commentator wrote, would have congratulated her. The new Africa is asking questions. And that was the turning point. The silence that once protected power had become a sign of guilt. The continent had found its voice again, not through revolution, but through the courage of those willing to speak when silence was easier. In the days following Khama's explosive speech and the African Union's damning report, Tanzania slipped into a strange, uneasy silence. The streets were calm but not peaceful. Markets reopened, schools functioned. Yet there was a tension in the air that no one could quite name. You could feel it in the way soldiers lingered at intersections and in the way people lowered their voices when mentioning the president's name. Inside, the government panic was quietly brewing. What had started as an election victory was rapidly mutating into a legitimacy crisis. Ministers who once spoke confidently in press conferences began avoiding cameras. The president's advisors, many of them Western-educated technocrats, drafted statements of national unity that no one believed. Then came the withdrawals. Within a week, major development partners, the European Union, Canada, and the African Development Bank froze funding for governance programs, citing institutional irregularities. A $300 million infrastructure loan from the World Bank was quietly postponed. Even Kenya, Tanzania's largest trade partner, suspended a joint border project for review. For the first time since independence, Tanzania found itself isolated not by sanctions, but by distrust. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens began to feel the chill of political retaliation. Local activists who had shared clips of William Ruto's interview or Khama's speech were summoned by police for questioning. At least 47 journalists were reportedly detained or had their equipment confiscated. Popular radio stations in Dar es Salaam and Mwanza were suddenly under maintenance. And yet, despite the clampdown, the conversation did not die, it only changed shape. In bars and buses, in WhatsApp groups and church gatherings, Tanzanians whispered a new word with both fear and pride: mwisho. The end. The end of pretending, the end of silence, the end of blind obedience. Across the border in Kenya, Uganda, and Zambia, student movements picked up the chant. 98% is not democracy, read placards outside embassies. African youth, usually dismissed as apathetic, began to reclaim their voice, seeing Tanzania as a cautionary tale and a mirror of their own struggles. The ripple effects reached deeper into politics than anyone expected. Within the African Union's Peace and Security Council, several states pushed for a review of Tanzania's membership privileges. Discussions of a temporary suspension, once unthinkable, made their way onto official agendas. Though no consensus was reached, the signal was unmistakable. The era of unchecked immunity was over. Inside Tanzania, the ruling party scrambled to regain control of the narrative. Pro-government rallies were staged with crowds bussed in and handed identical placards reading "We stand with Samia." But the optics fooled no one. The more the government shouted about loyalty, the more it revealed its insecurity. Behind closed doors, a handful of senior officers within the Tanzanian Defense Forces reportedly advised restraint. They feared that escalating repression could provoke a reaction from regional allies, or worse, from within the ranks. Some officers had trained alongside Burkinabe and Malian soldiers, now aligned with the alliance of Sahel states ES, a bloc inspired by Ibrahim Traoré's vision of sovereignty and integrity. These men understood one thing clearly: legitimacy cannot be commanded. It must be earned. By the end of November 2025, Tanzania stood at a crossroads. To the outside world, it was still functioning, but within the foundation was cracking. The crisis had revealed something deeper than political manipulation. It exposed a generation's impatience with the old order, with presidents for life and elections scripted like theater. And as Africa watched, one truth echoed from Ouagadougou to Nairobi: you can silence your critics, but you cannot silence the age that is coming. From Washington to Brussels, the unfolding Tanzanian crisis landed like a quiet shockwave, not because it was unexpected, but because it marked a new kind of rebellion in African diplomacy. For decades, Western governments had criticized African elections from the outside, often in carefully worded statements that achieved little. This time, however, the censure was coming from within Africa itself, from its own presidents, generals, and parliaments. In Washington, analysts at the State Department and the Wilson Center described the events as the most significant regional rupture since Zimbabwe 2008. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, while avoiding direct condemnation, called for respecting democratic principles and human rights across East Africa. Privately, American officials admitted that what disturbed them most was not the election result itself, but the scale of defiance from African peers. The United States had long relied on Tanzania as a stabilizing partner in the Horn of Africa, home to American counterterrorism programs and health initiatives. But a government that no longer commanded the confidence of its own region became a liability. Within weeks, Washington froze $72 million in non-humanitarian aid earmarked for governance and security reform. The message was clear: legitimacy still matters. In Europe, the tone hardened even further. The European Union's External Action Service issued a formal statement citing credible evidence of electoral manipulation and human rights violations. Germany suspended joint energy projects, and France, unusually vocal in East African matters, withdrew its ambassador for consultations. But it was in Africa's global image where the greatest shift was visible. Western newspapers like The Guardian, Le Monde, and The New York Times framed the crisis not as another African scandal, but as a generational divide, an older model of power facing the rise of a younger, bolder African consciousness, one that refused to stay silent. Editorials asked whether this new wave of African leadership, represented by figures such as Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso and William Ruto in Kenya, might signal the beginning of a self-correcting Africa, one where moral courage would no longer depend on Western approval. Meanwhile, China and Russia took a more cautious tone. Beijing, still a major investor in Tanzania's ports and railways, called the events internal matters and urged political stability. Moscow, seeking closer ties with the Sahel bloc, led by Traoré, used the crisis to criticize Western interference, portraying it as proof that African nations were still trapped between two competing spheres of influence. Yet, away from diplomatic corridors, the global public opinion told a different story. Across social media, millions of Africans in the diaspora, from Atlanta to Paris to Johannesburg, shared clips of Khama's speech, calling him the voice Africa had been waiting for. Petitions circulated demanding international investigations into the Tanzanian election. For older generations in the West, long accustomed to viewing Africa as a place of silence and submission, the sight of African leaders holding one another accountable was nothing short of revolutionary. As one American columnist wrote in Foreign Policy, "When African leaders start disciplining each other, that's when we know democracy has taken root, not because of Washington's sermons, but because of Africa's own conscience." In that sense, the world wasn't witnessing a Tanzanian tragedy. It was witnessing an African awakening, one that reminded even the superpowers that accountability can no longer be imported. It must be homegrown. By December 2025, the dust had not settled, it had only shifted. Tanzania's government insisted that its overwhelming mandate was proof of stability, not manipulation. But the world had already moved on from believing that numbers alone could measure legitimacy. For the first time in decades, a sitting African president was not only questioned by her own people, but by her peers, and that changed everything. What unfolded across East and Southern Africa was more than a political crisis. It was a mirror held up to the continent. It reflected the exhaustion of old habits, the handshakes between presidents who never questioned each other, the applause for unity, even when built on silence, and the use of democracy as decoration rather than conviction. The Tanzanian election did not just expose one leader's overreach, it revealed the limits of an entire political culture. But in that exposure came something powerful, a renewal. From Nairobi to Ouagadougou, from Gaborone to Accra, a new rhythm began to pulse through the continent. Young Africans began to realize that the silence of their leaders could no longer define them. Civil society journalists and reformist politicians drew strength not from fear, but from the knowledge that truth once spoken has a life of its own. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré had once warned that a nation that hides its truth is already conquered. That message, once dismissed as radical, now resonated across the continent. For the first time, Africans weren't waiting for approval from Paris, Washington, or Brussels. They were beginning to hold one another to higher standards, not out of rivalry, but out of shared dignity. Still, the lesson of Tanzania carries a warning. When power becomes deaf, it breeds revolt. When leadership loses humility, it loses legitimacy. And when democracy becomes performance, the audience eventually walks out. The world is watching, but more importantly, Africa is watching itself, and that may be the most revolutionary act of all. So to you watching this, do you believe that this new wave of African courage can truly last? Do you believe that leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, who speak of sovereignty, accountability, and self-respect, represent the future? Or are they merely voices crying out in a storm? If you believe that truth and leadership must finally walk hand in hand on African soil, share this story. Subscribe if you believe that Africa's awakening must not be silenced again. Because history is changing before our eyes, and this time the silence has finally broken.